Hi, welcome to Chapter 9 in the ACSM Advanced Exercise Physiology course. Today we're talking about the cardiovascular system, specifically design and control. What is exactly controlled? Well, blood flow is controlled. In order to do that, you need a main pump. Controls cardiac output. That, of course, is the heart. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped per minute into the system. And it can be calculated as stroke volume times heart rate. We all know what heart rate is. It's how many beats per minute. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that's pumped from the left ventricle each beat. Cardiac output is typically abbreviated as a capital Q. So you'll see Q equals heart rate times stroke volume. There are a lot of mechanisms that control major cardiovascular responses. When you exercise, skeletal muscle contracts, releasing specific chemicals, messengers, hydrogen, for example, CO2. There's also a surge in blood flow, and the surge in blood flow in between contractions adds to shear force, stimulates endothelial nitric oxide synthase, causes dilation. So baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, and they send a signal to the central command, which then interprets this signal and then sends it to the effectors. For example, the heart. The heart rate will increase. Stroke volume will also increase, sending more blood to the rest of the body. Now, what makes the heart rate increase in the context of this study, in this class, my apologies, it depends on what your heart rate is. So your normal resting heart rate for most people is going to be anywhere between 60 and 70. If you're particularly fit, it could be substantially lower. I've seen it as low as 43. But if the heart were to beat on its own with no external influence, it would be around 100 beats per minute, possibly 110. So in order to achieve your normal resting heart rate, you have to have something that slows it down. And that's the parasympathetic activity of the heart. So your vagus nerve, your 10th cranial nerve, sends a signal to the heart. Parasympathetic activity. The more parasympathetic activity you have going to the heart, the lower under 100 your heart rate will be. So if you have a natural resting heart rate of 60 and you stand up off the sofa to go and get a drink from the refrigerator and your heart rate goes up to 70, you have a decrease in parasympathetic innervation. If it goes above 100, that is an increase in sympathetic activity. So the sympathetic nervous system increases heart rate above 100. So if you were to get off the sofa and then run up 2 flights of stairs, because that's the closest bathroom, for example, well, your heart rate would go from 60 to 100, and that's a withdrawal of your parasympathetic nervous system. And then the sympathetic nervous system would kick in and take your heart rate higher, whatever it would be, running up 3 flights of stairs, let's say 130. So first you decrease parasympathetic, then you increase sympathetic to get it above 100. Well, on your way back down, your heart rate's coming down. Instead of 130, now it's 110. That doesn't mean you have parasympathetic activity happening. It means you have less sympathetic. When it gets down to 100, you have neither sympathetic nor parasympathetic. And then you're sitting down watching your movie again, and it starts to come down below 100, you are then slowly increasing parasympathetic activity. Stroke volume, for example, how much volume you pump per beat, it's influenced by several factors. One is preload, and that's the volume of blood in the ventricle prior to contraction. So for our examples, we'll just use the left side of the heart, since that side goes to systemic circulation instead of the pulmonary circulation. So it's the volume in the left ventricle just before it contracts. After load, the pressure that the left ventricle needs to overcome in order to eject blood to the systemic circulation. And there is always blood left in the ventricle. So you have pressure to overcome and thus have volume left in the ventricle. Ventricular contractility, that is how hard your heart muscles will contract. The higher the contractility, the harder the contraction, and the more blood you force out, increasing stroke volume. So it varies with heart rate because it changes in filling time, for example, for the ventricles. And your heart rate can go up pretty high during normal exercise without causing a problem to stroke volume. Depending on how fit you are, it can go up even higher. So if your heart rate is going to effectively change cardiac output, stroke volume has to be maintained or even increased. Now during exercise, we're going to learn about some things that cause it to increase. There's an example in your book looking at dogs that are stimulated to have a higher heart rate, and they see that cardiac output increases initially, but then levels off and even decreases. And then they put these dogs on an exercise test, and they saw cardiac output kept increasing. So there is the theory that if your heart rate is too high, you don't have enough time to properly fill the ventricles. And that's true even during exercise, but it has to be very high, like around 195 beats per minute. The exercise portion of that test with the dogs is actually protecting the cardiac output. And it does that by increasing the venous return, which we're going to get to. Here's the example I just referenced. So this is where the canines had their heart rate chemically increased, stroke volume then actually dropped. And this is on an exercise test, substantially higher heart rates and substantially higher stroke volume and cardiac output. So recall that cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. So if cardiac output plateaus as heart rate increases, then stroke volume must decrease. And that's not the case with the dotted line here, because they have exercise going on, which is increasing the amount of blood going back to the heart. Something else that affects the cardiac output is the peripheral vascular resistance. And vascular resistance you may think of as blood pressure or hypertension even. It's controlled by arterioles. There's several levels of arterioles, but those are the ones that have the biggest change in pressure. They're thick-walled vessels that have a fair amount of smooth muscle, and they can dilate, easing pressure, allowing more blood to flow, or they can constrict or contract, decreasing the radius and increasing resistance. So the amount of perfusion pressure for an arteriole equals the flow times the resistance. If you dilate, you decrease the resistance and you have more perfusion. If you constrict those arterioles, you have either less perfusion or higher pressure because the blood has to travel faster. Venous capacitance. Your veins are actually a reservoir for blood in your body, and you can control how much they hold or how much they send back into the arterial circulation because they have smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle around these veins can also contract. So when they contract, and this is typically due to sympathetic nervous system activity, the diameter gets smaller, so the total volume of the veins decreases, sending more blood back towards the heart so it can go back into arterial circulation. There's also what we call the skeletal muscle pump, and since veins have valves that prevent the backflow of blood, when they constrict with the sympathetic nervous system, blood only flows one direction. Same with the skeletal muscle pump. You contract your skeletal muscles and it literally squeezes on these veins, making the diameter smaller, forcing the blood back towards the heart since it can't flow backwards due to these one-way valves. feed-forward and feedback reflex cardiovascular control during exercise. Volition to exercise can elicit significant cardiovascular responses as part of a feed-forward system. Your body recognizes that there's a big increase in activity, and it makes several adjustments to try and compensate for it and even prepare for additional activity. One example is when you start to exercise, you have a rapid increase in heart rate right at the beginning. Well, as we talked about before, heart rate's controlled primarily through the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, the initial rise in your heart rate at the onset of exercise is typically going to be to a decrease in parasympathetic activity, because prior to exercise, you're typically resting or standing still, so your heart rate's under 100. So it'll go from 60 or 70, whatever it is, up to 100 very quickly, and that's because of the immediate drop of parasympathetic activity. You have arterial baroreceptors as well, and those are located within the walls of some of the larger arteries like the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, and they actually sense differences in arterial pressure. The change in the level of activity or exercise in response to changes in arterial pressure, or the other way around, you have a change in the activity of blood flow because you change the physical activity, and it causes changes in arterial pressure. So to make it more clear, you start to exercise, your heart rate increases, the cardiac output increases, and therefore you have an increase in pressure in those larger arteries. That pressure is detected by baroreceptors, which can actually help control blood pressure in a short-term way. If the pressure in, say, the carotid arteries becomes high, those feed the brain, and you want to protect the brain from too much blood pressure. So what happens, these baroreceptors detect the pressure and then send a signal to the command saying, look, the pressure here in the carotid is high, and then the brain can then send a signal via the autonomic nervous system to slow the heart rate down, so you can decrease cardiac output, and the less liquid you put into the system, the lower the pressure. So that will actually reduce the pressure at the baroreceptors of the carotid artery. Another example is just sitting still and doing deep breathing. We mentioned two ways to increase venous return already: the sympathetic nervous system causing venous constriction and the muscle pump. Well, there's a third, and that's the respiratory pump. So as you inhale, your diaphragm contracts and puts pressure in your thoracic cavity, sending additional blood to the heart via the inferior vena cava. So if you are sitting in an upright position, resting, low heart rate, and you can take a deep breath, you'll find that your heart rate increases. And if you slowly let it out, your heart rate will drop. And this is because of the change in pressure detected at the aortic arch. A deep breath in causes the additional venous return, which increases cardiac output and raises the pressure somewhat at the aortic arch. That pressure is detected by the baroreceptor, sends a signal that the pressure is up, and then the heart rate increases. As you exhale, you are decreasing the amount of blood going to the heart. The pressure is now lower, and the result is that your heart rate will decrease. So basically, sending more blood to the heart causes an increase in heart rate because of the localized baroreceptors, and sending less blood to the heart causes a decrease in heart rate, again, because of the local baroreceptors. There's an inverse relationship between the heartbeat interval and the heart rate. This should come as no surprise, because as your heart rate increases, if you're to look at a QRS complex or the drawing of an ECG, you'd see that those QRS complexes are closer together with a higher heart rate and farther apart with a lower heart rate. Here we see as heart rate increases from rest to various intensity of exercise, we see that pressure in the carotid sinus arteries also increases. again, likewise, with an increase in mean arterial pressure, which you could think of as the pressure that the left ventricle has to overcome to pump blood. With increased mean arterial pressure from rest to light to moderate to heavy exercise, we also see a higher increase in carotid sinus pressure. Now, we did mention this before. Exercise alters baroreflex mechanisms. Well, this occurs not just with exercise, but also at rest. Your baroreflex would be your baroreceptors detect a change in pressure. They send a message to the central command, and the central command uses the autonomic nervous system to adjust the heart rate. So during exercise, you have an increase in cardiac output. It increases the pressure in the various arteries, which is detected by the baroreceptors. And at high intensity exercise, you're going to have the sympathetic nervous system as a stronger contributor to changes in heart rate, where at rest, it's primarily going to be the parasympathetic. So with the deep breathing example I gave, that's going to be a change in your parasympathetic innervation to your heart. So a theoretical effect of 50% reduction in blood flow to the skeletal muscle. Here we see blood flow, conductance, and resistance. Well, blood flow is self-explanatory. It's the amount of blood that flows within a given tissue. Vascular resistance, however, is the perfusion pressure divided by blood flow. And conductance is the blood flow divided by perfusion pressure. So if you look at blood flow, during exercise, if you have sympathetic nervous system causing venous constriction, that can theoretically have approximately 50% reduction in total blood flow to that tissue bed. And we see the same pattern with conductance, which is your blood flow is divided by perfusion pressure. However, with resistance, we see kind of an opposite effect because the equation is opposite. Skeletal muscle afferents. We have muscle metaboreceptors, and they detect changes of metabolic intermediates. As the working skeletal muscle produces things such as lactate and hydrogen and CO2, we can have robust changes in the cardiovascular system. You can see large increases in heart rate, ventricular performance, cardiac output, and even peripheral vasoconstriction and central blood volume mobilization. Thus, things created in the active working muscle have a profound effect on control of the vascular system. Now, this might become particularly important when doing intervals and considering whether to do active or passive recovery. With interval training, it's typically high intensity, and you can produce quite a bit of muscle metabolites. And if you're doing passive recovery, these metabolites remain in the muscle substantially longer, having a peripheral vasoconstriction effect, thereby reducing the amount of blood going to the muscle. However, if you're doing active recovery, you are creating an oxygen demand, and the rhythmic contraction and relaxation of the muscle causes increases of shear force intermittently, which stimulate enos and nitric oxide and vasodilation. It's important to keep in mind that these different systems that help control the cardiovascular system work together. There's not one thing that controls one other thing. They're always overlapping systems. So although they play different roles in different phases, oftentimes they act together. For example, the immediate rapid rise in heart rate at the beginning of exercise could be due to the activation of central command, a rapid resetting of the arterial baroreflex, or the activation of skeletal muscle mechanoreceptors. Likely it's a combination of all of the above. physical activity and inactivity. People typically say that exercise is good for you, but there's a growing trend to flip that on its head, really, and say instead of exercise is good for you, it's that physical inactivity is bad for you. It's more than just semantics. To say that exercise is good for you would imply that it's something that we wouldn't normally need to do. So you do something extra to provide a health benefit. But our bodies were actually designed to be very physically active. So by removing something like physical activity that our bodies are designed to do, that causes problems in health. Therefore, we say physical inactivity is bad for you and is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease as well as metabolic disease. There's a spectrum of physical activity or inactivity for cardiovascular health, and it doesn't necessarily take much physical activity to help preserve cardiovascular health. Most physically inactive receive the greatest benefit from even a small increased level of physical activity, which makes sense. The more inactive you are, the better the benefit of becoming somewhat active would be. There is a risk of overtraining. You could have an orthostatic intolerance. While I acknowledge there is a risk of overtraining, it's incredibly rare for people to overtrain just when they're exercising for health. That's typically seen more in elite athletes. These days, with the large increase in metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease, there's an increasing amount of study for the inactivity physiology. So as exercise physiology students, we study both the physiology of exercise, but also it's important to study what goes wrong with inactivity. So here we see a graph of the cardiovascular benefits. So you see positive cardiovascular health in people that are highly trained, elite athletes, trained athletes, even physically active walkers and joggers. And while there is an increase in cardiovascular health when you go from just physically active walker and jogger all the way to highly trained elite athlete, it's not substantial. So it is possible to have low to moderate physical activity and still maintain a fairly healthy cardiovascular system. Of course, it starts to come down a little bit if you get to overtraining, but as I mentioned, that's not that common, especially with the general population. And then you get into very physically inactive. Here's your couch potato, very unhealthy, and it's not a huge difference between your average couch potato that doesn't realize that they have chronic disease and the people that know they have chronic disease. Diseased group, hospitalized, bedridden, etc. They're both quite unhealthy. Your physical inactivity or activity induced changes in the baroreceptor reflexes. Important adaptive changes brought about by increases and decreases in physical activity that alter the reflex regulation of the cardiovascular system. Dynamic exercise training attenuates arterial or aortic baroreflector responses and sensitizes your cardiopulmonary afferents. It's also accompanied by a decreased resting heart rate or bradycardia, reduced sympathetic activity, so you can have dilation of arteries, and a blunted cardiovascular response to exercise. Mechanisms possibly contributing to training-induced changes in cardiovascular reflexes include altered baroreceptor or baroreflex function, structural and or autonomic changes to the heart and blood vessels, and altered hemodynamic responses during exercise. On the flip side, physical inactivity can produce the opposite changes, and in extreme cases can lead to orthostatic intolerance that's observed in highly fit individuals. Another thing that happens with training is you have an increase in blood volume, so you can have more blood in your system. When you have more blood, it is less viscous, so it can flow easier. So you have a higher stroke volume because you have more blood going to the heart, and it is less thick, which is so it's easier to pump. So it's not pumping as quickly. You have dilated arteries so that you have a larger amount of flow with a smaller amount of velocity. And that lowers the heart rate, and it lowers the hypertension. With physical inactivity, you have a constricting of the arteries, you have a decrease in plasma volume, so not only is the blood more viscous and harder to pump, but you have more narrow arteries to pump them through, raising blood pressure.